there's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's 7:15 p.m. on an ordinary March evening in Melbourne in 1999, and Elizabeth Barber is serving up dinner to her two youngest daughters. She keeps glancing at the door. Her eldest, Rachel, and her husband, Mike, should already be home. 15-year-old Rachel is a full-time dance student. After a day at the studio, she was supposed to meet her dad at the tram stop. At 7:40 p.m, the phone rings. It's Mike. Rachel never got off the tram. As her parents soon find out, Rachel had been telling her friends and her boyfriend that she had a paying job that night. She was going to earn $100, and she was going to spend it on some shoes she had her eye on. She was guarded about what the job was. It was a secret, but it wasn't anything to worry about. She was going with an old female friend, she'd told them. What could possibly go wrong? In the days after Rachel went missing, her family plastered Melbourne in more than 2,000 posters, appealing for anyone who might have seen her. For days, they kept hope alive. But on day 12 of their frantic search, they were delivered the worst news imaginable. Rachel, their beloved daughter, granddaughter and sister, had been murdered. Her killer was a 19-year-old who used to live across the street, a former babysitter, a friend of the family. A young woman filled with jealousy, self-hate and an obsession with the beautiful, talented Rachel, who she'd been stalking for several years. Criminal court reporter Megan Norris has written a book alongside Elizabeth, Rachel's mum, called Perfect Victim. It details two sides of this story. The family's heart-rending experience told through first-person recollections and letters written to Rachel, and the analysis of the case itself. Megan joins us now. Megan, tell me about the Barber family and what their life looked like in 1999.
They were just a regular family. They were very artistic, all of them. They're that sort of arty family that strikes you straight away. Very creative, very kind, quiet living sort of people. Don't drink, don't smoke, just quietly living their life. Dad was a toy maker, Mike, so he made toys from home. Elizabeth worked in a bookshop in Melbourne, a very well-known bookshop. But her father, Ivan Southall, was a very famous Australian children's author with Penguin Books. So he was very well known. But the family, she got three young girls. In 1999, Rachel would have been just 15. Ashley Rose would have been around 10. And I think Heather would have been around 7. They just lived a quiet little life in a very sleepy suburb of Melbourne in Mont Albert. It's a very leafy, older, traditional suburb, you know, and full of old houses. And they lived across the road from these neighbours who also had 3 daughters who lived directly opposite. Their girls were a few years each in age older than Elizabeth and Mike's children. So Rachel at that time was 15. So Caroline over the road, the oldest of the 3 girls over the road, would have been 19 then, just 19.
Before we tell this story, I want to ask you about your relationship with the Barbers, because you've actually written a book alongside Elizabeth, Rachel's mum. What was that experience like?
Well, I'd never written a book at all before. So I'd come from news where I wrote short, sharp stories in a hurry, as you'd know.
Yes.
So I was used to being told, 500 words in half an hour. Can you do it? And I'd go and do it. And I covered court. So that was my job. And I met Elizabeth through that job. So I was covering the court case, and I'd gone to do an interview for Woman's Day or one of the magazines. And so it was heartbreaking. And I visited them a few times over that time, and I continued to follow the case to its conclusion. And she said, I'm going to write a book when all this is over. And she was keeping meticulous journals. She could process it by keeping journals. And it allows you to get some of that stuff that goes round and round your head onto a computer screen. It sort of unloadens the burden I find with victims of violent crime. Keeping journals is often something that they do. So she proposed this idea, I'd like to write a book and think I'm going to propose a book. And apparently she did. Her proposal was to write a heartfelt book about a mother's journey through grief. And more to the point, the mother of a 15-year-old missing girl that she knew from the minute that little girl did not come home, she knew something terrible had happened. I would cover the police investigation to find Rachel. And they weren't looking for a murderer. They were looking for a missing girl at that time. They thought she'd run away. And I would do that side of the story. And I would also paint a picture of what was going on in Caroline's life and those factors that had led her to tip over the edge and make this plan for a murder. So it had to add balance to Elizabeth's heartbreaking part of the book, which was a personal journey through grief. And each one was told from a different perspective. And it actually worked really well.
Let's talk about the night Rachel went missing, because Elizabeth talks about that in such great detail, about the panic that she felt.
Yeah.
Why were they so quick to raise the alarm when Rachel went missing?
Because in many ways she wasn't a regular teenager. She didn't have a mobile phone. There were families that didn't own a mobile phone. This was a family. They did things the old-fashioned way, They picked people up. They didn't call. They made arrangements and stuck to them. So when Mike drove to Camberwell to meet Rachel from the tram and she didn't get off, he was immediately alarmed. She'd got this lovely boyfriend and they were doing things together. So she thought maybe he would know where she was. But he had to ring home to let Elizabeth know Rachel hadn't got off the tram. And they immediately panicked because it was completely out of character. She was extremely compliant, very reliable, and she didn't do anything out of the ordinary ever, and certainly not without telling her family. I think Mike went back home, about half an hour drive, and as soon as he walked in, Elizabeth said she knew something terrible had happened. They rang her boyfriend, Manny, and he said, no, she's not with me, and I don't know where she's gone. But I think he said that she'd mentioned something about going to meet an old friend, and they were really baffled by that. What old friend? Who's she gone to meet? And they said to Manny, did she tell you anything about that? And he said, no, it was a secret. Now, she didn't keep secrets from him. She adored him. She told him absolutely everything. So even he thought that was odd. Everything about that night was odd. So immediately they thought something untoward had happened.
Were the police as quick to think something was wrong?
No, and that was why Elizabeth wanted to do the book, I think because of her experience, and I'll explain that, as you'd know, in news. And I thought about this a lot after I wrote the book. If someone came into the office and said, look, my daughter's gone missing an hour ago, the first thing I would say is, how old is she? And unfortunately, if they said she's a 15-year-old girl, I'd think she'll probably be back in a few hours. That's the biggest number of missing people are 15-year-old girls. And so when 15-year-old girls normally go missing, it's usually they've gone to a party or mum and dad have told them they can't do something and they've thought, well, I'm doing it. And they've gone off and done it anyway. Then they know they're in trouble. So they think, well, I'm in trouble anyway. I might as well stop out all night. And they crash at a friend's and turn up tomorrow feeling sorry for themselves. And they know they're in for it. They're in trouble. And that is what happened. They went straight to the police station on that night and reported Rachel missing. That was the reaction of the police. That would have been my reaction if they'd have come into the office. And I would honestly have thought, if I run this story, by tomorrow she will have turned up feeling sorry for herself and in trouble. And I will have wasted everybody's time. And I think the police's attitude is wait and see for 48 hours. She'll probably come back tomorrow. But they knew, they knew their daughter. And they said, surely the first 48 hours are very important. Well, we know they are with missing kids or missing people. And that first 48 hours is crucial. So the police delay in that was very upsetting and frustrating for Mike and Elizabeth.
Can you paint the picture of who Rachel was and tell us what her life was like at the time? You mentioned that she was the eldest of 3 kids. She was also a full-time dance student, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was. She was different. She was very creative and she was a little girl with big dreams. She was dreaming of being in musicals like Cats. She wanted to go to the West End and dance on the West End. It was all she ever did. It was more than a passion. It was like the air she breathed. It was who she was. And I remember going there to visit Elizabeth in the early days, and she showed me a video. It was called Rachel and Her Sisters. It really sticks in my mind. And even as a really little girl, she wouldn't have been very old, so her little sisters then were really little. But she was dancing with veils and floating around, and the little kids were sitting there soaking it up. They were the audience. Mum and Dad were the audience. She was doing it from the time she could walk. I believe she was destined for really big things. And so Mum and Dad encouraged that. She didn't like school. She hated school. All she wanted to do was dance. And in the end, she was so unhappy. They thought they might as well bite the bullet. And so that she'd been going to this lovely dance school in Richmond. And Mum and Dad thought, well, why don't you go full-time? I think her boyfriend, Manny, was a full-time student there. And a couple of other kids were. And that's all she wanted to do.
You mentioned that she'd told Manny that she was going to see a female friend or an old female friend. What were the other clues that she'd let on to her fellow dance classmates? She'd said things along the lines of, I've got a pair of shoes, I've got a paying job, little tidbits that her parents kind of started piecing together.
Yeah, that was sort of drifting out. It was almost like that information started to filter through over those days, those very first couple of days she was missing, because they were totally baffled. She was always with Manny. She was joined at the hip. They were inseparable. Where else could she possibly have gone? She didn't have a lot of friends, and they were all in the dance thing. She said things like, I've got a little job that's going to earn me a lot of money. She told Manny that. And the day before she went missing, they'd gone out into Richmond, I think at lunchtime, and she had taken Manny, very excited, and pointed out this wildly expensive pair of shoes in a shop. And she was very excited, and she said, when I get the money, I'm going to buy those shoes. It was a big deal for her, these shoes. And he said, where are you going to get the money from? She said, well, I've got a little job. It's a secret. I can't tell anyone. So all these things started to surface in the hours after she went missing.
What was the relationship like between Caroline and the Barbers? Her family lived across the road. How close were they?
Yes, it was a bit of that. They were very different. They're total opposites, polar opposites. So, Elizabeth and Micah, they lived on the smell of an oily rag. They were frugal. They didn't waste money. The kids didn't have mobiles. They lived a quiet life. The family over the road, Mum and Dad's marriage was not good. And I believe that must have been affecting Caroline too, in her teens. And Gail over the road, Caroline's mum, was very friendly with Elizabeth. I would say Elizabeth and Mike were more friendly with Gail because David, Caroline's father, was always working. He was a very accomplished businessman. He was very successful, and he was working a lot. And Gail would constantly drift over and sit in the kitchen with Elizabeth, and over cups of coffee and cups of tea, she'd say things weren't great at home. Caroline was giving them problems. They had a lot of dysfunction in the family. Gail was quite depressed and unhappy, and had told Elizabeth that she wasn't feeling very secure in her marriage, wasn't very happy. They were having a lot of difficulties with Caroline, who was a troublesome teenager. She was quite disengaged. Teenagers are. I've got one here. They grunt and they don't talk. But she became very withdrawn. It was more than that. She would babysit. Caroline became Rachel and Ashley Rose and Heather's babysitter. So she was nearly 5 years older. So she would come over when Rachel was about 10, and she would have been about 14, 15, and she would come over and babysit for them. They were quite friendly as neighbours. I don't think they socialised together or anything like that, but they were quite friendly as neighbours. Elizabeth's very kind and very empathetic, and I think she felt sad and sorry that the girl was unhappy and she was basically struggling on her own. And eventually the marriage did collapse, but I think it was in free fall.
Well, part of Caroline's kind of problems, I guess you could say, was that she had an awfully low self-esteem of herself, didn't she?
She had very, very low confidence, and that came through quite significantly. My role was to sort of make, when children are murdered especially, the focus is on the background of the killer, what made them do it. And Elizabeth didn't want that to be the book. She wanted people to understand this was a real little girl, put a human face to that tragedy, my job was to be more objective and was to look at the factors that were influencing Caroline in her formative years. What led to that point? So I was looking at her from quite young. She was the oldest of three. She wasn't close to her sisters. She fought with them and argued with them, and that certainly came out in her own writing. She also kept journals. She painted her room completely black in her teens, completely black, and stopped coming out. She wouldn't come out. She became very gothic in her appearance, dyed her hair black, piercings. And I think it's a dead giveaway, She became very overweight, and I think that was because she was depressed. Certainly her writing spoke to a depressed young girl. But she's hiding herself in her room. Very significant that she painted her room black. I think she was immersed in that blackness. It's sort of very telling. It's a metaphor, isn't it, for the miserable hole she's feeling like she's drowning in. Puts on a lot of weight and becomes very belligerent, but she clings to her father. She's obviously had a very close relationship with Dad, and I think he had moved out by then. And she was really struggling with that rejection. It wasn't just him rejecting Mum, it was personally him rejecting her.
Let's talk about some of the clues that suggested initially that Caroline might have been involved. So this is once the police actually started to look into the case, quite a few days after Elizabeth and Mike had gone to them worried. There was a witness that had seen the two girls on a tram, and there was a phone tap that they managed to find. Can you tell us about them?
Yes, she didn't come into the picture until quite late on, which I think is really interesting because they really had no clues. Then people started to come forward. What they did was they did a photo, identikit photo. So this young girl was a girl that Rachel had known from when she was younger. She wasn't at the dance school. She was a girl that remembered Rachel from some time ago, an older girl. And she saw a story. I think they went on Australia's Most Wanted. It was one of those missing persons shows, and she saw it. This girl had got a photographic memory. She really did. And she recalled seeing Rachel with an older girl that she didn't recognise on the tram to Paran, which is baffling to Mike and Elizabeth because it was a suburb that they never went to. What on earth would she be doing in Paran? But this girl was adamant that she had seen her talking with this older girl, overweight girl, on a tram. The family found out about this. I think that she may have rang the house and spoken with Elizabeth, and they immediately contacted the police. So she went and made a statement, and it would have been on the afternoon she disappeared. So Manny saw her off, and she went off to catch this tram for this secret appointment that she had. And the girl saw her on the tram and did this identikit photo from memory. And it was amazingly like her. Mm. She had an absolutely photographic memory. And from that, other people started to come forward. The police by now had put a tap on the phones. And they had found that Elizabeth had had calls in that time lapse after Rachel went missing. So Caroline had obviously called the house to sort of suss out what was going on. But she'd also made previous calls to the house, long ones, lengthy phone calls that Elizabeth didn't know anything about. And so some of those calls were to Rachel. And there had been a particular call, Elizabeth then remembered, some time before, Caroline had called the house out of the blue. And what had happened was they had moved suburbs. So the Barbers had moved from Mont Albert to Bayswater North, several suburbs away. It was a move a couple of years before. So it was odd for Elizabeth to suddenly have this phone call out of the blue from Caroline, asking details about Rachel's birth date, asking about Elizabeth's maiden name, Southall, asking all these odd pieces of random information. And Elizabeth asked her what she wanted them for. And she said, I'm doing a school project on Rachel. Well, at the time, Elizabeth didn't give it any thought at all. She just didn't give it any thought. She didn't think to say, what is it about? Why are you doing this? It just didn't occur to her. And they're a very trusting family. Yeah, so what we now know is that Caroline was collecting information. It wasn't for a project. Well, it was for a project. It was for a project for murder. But she was collecting information because she had applied for Rachel's birth certificate because she was already refining a blueprint for murder. And no one knew that. You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Barth.
I'm speaking with Megan Norris about the murder of Rachel Barber. Up next, we find out just how deep Caroline's obsession with Rachel went. When the police started seeing these links between Caroline and Rachel, what did they initially think? They weren't thinking down the murder route. They were more just thinking that these two young women, one of them a teenager, had just run away together or something.
They did. And even when she came onto the radar, for a long while there were no leads. They had to apply for a sort of writ to get onto Telstra to give them permission to access outgoing and ingoing calls. So they were able to do that. And they started to see this link from this person. And then there was a photo of this girl. So now they got another teenager on the radar. And they thought maybe it was some plan they'd got to run away. Maybe they're going on an adventure. Maybe they were planning a holiday, a bit of a weekend. But it was all odd to the Barbers because, and Manny, her boyfriend, said, there's no way she would have done that. So the police were looking at her more to say, do you know where she is? Do you know something about where she may be? They were still looking for a missing girl, a runaway, in their mind. And despite Elizabeth and Mike's protests to the contrary, there was nothing to suggest foul play. Do you know this girl? Yes, she used to babysit them. So they were looking like friends. So they had gone to the house. That all sort of paths then led to Caroline's apartment. So they got an address for her. Once they got a name, they got her workplace. When they got her workplace, they got her address. And she hadn't been into work for a few days around the time that Rachel disappeared. So that was a red flag. They still think she's got something to do with the disappearance, but not a murder. So the police go to the house and they knock on the door and no one answers. And there's obviously someone in. And I think they got quite panicky and they got a ladder and got up to the window. She was on an upper floor and they could see that she was unconscious. But Caroline was epileptic. So she'd had an epileptic fit. So they didn't know what had happened. They broke into the house. They called an ambulance, took her to hospital, still looking at a missing person. What do you know about this runaway girl? Anyway, after she came out of that epileptic fit, there's a period where they've got a medical name, I can't remember what it is, but it's where they're not quite with it. One of the detectives sat by the bed and her father came to the hospital, and with her father's permission, the detective spoke with Caroline, and the question was, do you know where Rachel is? Do you know where she may have gone? Those were the questions they were asking, as if she were a runaway. And she said, dead. Now, no one was expecting that.
No.
No one was expecting that. And he said, I beg your pardon. She said, she's dead. And they said, do you know where she is? Yes, she's buried in a pet cemetery on my dad's farm. They had a farm property out at Kilmore. And immediately Caroline's father said, I'll tell you where that is. I can draw you a map of the property. I know where the pet cemetery is. But they couldn't believe their ears. Meanwhile, the detectives were still at her flat looking for clues. And that's when the whole thing started to take a bit of a twist. So while two of the detectives were at the hospital with Caroline, the colleagues were going through the flat and they found a large bag of young women's clothes, which were clearly way too small for Caroline. So they were clothes that they thought belonged to Rachel. They didn't belong to Rachel. Caroline had bought them for her for this secret job. And the secret job was that she'd been lured there. Caroline had come up with this story. If you come round, we'll photograph you for a photo session. We'll get some photos done and you'll get paid lots of money. And we've got nice clothes for you to wear and we'll take these photos. Rachel did believe she was going to a proper appointment, but that's not what happened. So she'd gone to Caroline's flat for this appointment where Caroline had actually murdered her, but no one knew that. What the police also found, which was even more telling, at that apartment, they found a notebook with pages ripped out of it. And you've got an indent underneath where writing has been. You get an indentation. They'd got this new system that they'd just started to use in Victoria Police Forensics at that time, where they were able to put it under an infrared light. And it literally brought the words back to life. And what they found was a blueprint for murder. The chances of them finding that, it was absolutely a checklist for murder. And she had written it, rewritten it, revised it, refined, right down to the last letter, how she was going to get Rachel to the apartment, what she was going to do to her. and where she was going to dump her body and what would happen after that.
How did she say she was going to kill Rachel, and is that what happened?
Yes, she said she was going to strangle her. I think the plan also hinted at stabbing her eyes out.
There was also mention of lacing pizza with drowsy powder, so she'd kind of thought of everything in ways to kind of make Rachel submit to her.
Well, she was going to drug a pizza with sedatives, knock her out, and she was going to strangle her, cut her eyes out, and she was going to take the body to the country and dump her. She'd thought it through. Hire carpet cleaner in advance. Get carpets cleaned, because she imagined there'd be a mess. Hire a courier van, because she was epileptic. She didn't have a driving license, so she couldn't drive. So how was she going to get that body from her apartment to this place, which was a good 90 minutes drive away in the country towards central Victoria? So she thought of that. She was going to hire a van of some kind to do that, clean the carpets afterwards. So it's like a very organised blueprint for murder. Apply for Rachel's birth certificate. Reinvent yourself. She was going to assume Rachel's identity. That was the plan. The plan in a nutshell was to murder Rachel and steal her identity and come back as this bright, beautiful, happy, talented little girl over the road. Now remember, Caroline was very overweight, very depressed, very low self-worth, hated herself. And to her, Rachel epitomised the perfect girl. She described her as a white picket fence. You know, Rachel was the perfect victim in every way.
Some of those journal entries detailed this obsession that you're talking about, but in real kind of creepy detail, like this pure infatuation with Rachel.
Well, it was. They found notes which showed she'd been stalking Rachel. So this wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment plan. I think that's the big point for me. The dates on those notes, she started to plan that transformation into Rachel's image at the age of 14. So when you think about that, this girl in that time period, Caroline, from the time she was about 14, was planning the murder of a girl across the road. Now, this coincides with the time frame where she painted her room black, withdrew to her bedroom, was angry and fighting with her mother and sisters, very unhappy. The whole time she was in that room, she was writing and refining a blueprint for murder. So part of that blueprint for murder was to steal Rachel's identity. She had to become her. So as long ago as it was when she rang Elizabeth, some long time before, and said she was doing a project, she was actually collecting the information she needed to apply for Rachel's birth certificate, which she did. So that was like checked off the list, something that she did. She then had to think how she was going to morph into Rachel. So she had a plan entitled How to Change in 9 Weeks. And she actually drafted this very detailed plan. How to change in 9 weeks. Lose weight. Get rid of pimples. Dye hair. Change your facial looks. What the police also found with those notes, she had created this super creepy scrapbook where she had created an image of a hybrid girl. And this girl was the person she was going to be when she came back as Rachel Barber. At the time, Dawson's Creek was a big deal on telly at the time. It was a sort of cult watch teen TV series. So she'd got Katie Holmes's smile, Claire Danes' blonde hair, and she'd made notes like the way Claire Danes tilted her head in the Romeo and Juliet film. It was like, I'm going to model myself on that ingenue. I'm going to look like a mixture, a hybrid of Katie Holmes, Claire Danes, and Rachel Barber's eyes, which I thought was very significant. So she had pasted these photos into this scrapbook. I think we ran the pages in the book. She pasted all these photos of the look she wanted. And it was very much an ingenue teenage look. And she gave herself a new name. She was not going to call herself Rachel Barber. She was going to call herself Gem Southall. It was really interesting because Southall was Elizabeth's maiden name. So, and Gem, where did that come from? It's like she saw Rachel as a precious little jewel. But Gem Southall took root in Caroline's head really early on. So sometime between that period where she was 14 and the time she killed at 19, She was going to reinvent herself. She was planning to become someone else. And that someone was going to be a cross between all these beautiful, attractive, seductive young teenage girls, including Rachel Barber. And in her hybrid girl paste up, she had Rachel's eyes, and she made notes of it. Rachel's green eyes, Rachel's eyes. They were very important to her, which is why I think it became significant in that plan that she toyed with the idea of destroying Rachel's eyes. And I think if you think about it, strangulation is a very up-close and personal crime. The last eyes that Rachel would have seen were Caroline's, and the last eyes Caroline would have seen would have been Rachel's.
So chilling.
Yeah, it is chilling.
What was the plan? Was it to trick Rachel's family into thinking that she was her, or was it just to kind of steal her identity and kind of move away and create a whole new life?
Yes, part of her blueprint for murder was, she had this strange list: lose weight, new skin, facials, dye hair, get rid of pimples, move to Bondi. Gem Southall, and that name kept coming up. Gem Southall moved to Bondi. So basically she was going to go where all the beautiful people were. She was going to go to Bondi. And Bondi, at the time, she was a big reader of the women's magazines that I worked for, actually. And so, a lot of the celebs lived in Bondi at that time. She would have known that from her appetite for glamour magazines. And she was going to pop up in Bondi, a new persona, Gem Southall. And the old Caroline would be dead.
Was Rachel's body where she said it was going to be?
Yes, it was exactly where she said it was. The police were very shocked. I don't believe that they'd read Caroline her rights, because they weren't questioning her for anything other than where the friend may be. And so to have her suddenly admit to a murder, dead, I killed her, it's like, what?
Yeah.
So they stopped the interview as soon as she said that. But, well, where is she? So they then dispatched forensics out to Kilmore. And sure enough, there she was, exactly where Caroline said, buried in a shallow grave in what had been their pet cemetery.
It's obvious that this news is going to be devastating to the Barbers, but can you talk us through how Elizabeth speaks about finding that out after 10, 11, 12 days of searching everywhere for her, for holding out hope, and then getting that news?
They were absolutely devastated. They were devastated, but in her heart she knew. But it's still devastating. I spoke to Daniel Morecambe's mother about exactly that, all that time that he was missing, and they were looking. Even though in her heart she knew he'd gone, being told he's dead or he's been found, it was very final. And she said, nothing prepares you for it. And I always remember Mike's telling me this. They had a pool that you could see from their lounge room window. And he describes being out there mindlessly on this one day, just mindlessly sweeping the pool with a creepy crawler, getting leaves out, just mindlessly fishing leaves out of the pool when the police arrived, and there were two of them. Now, this is the first time they had seen these police, because they'd been dealing with missing persons unit. Suddenly, two homicide detectives turn up. They come into the house and say, "Where's your husband?" "He's outside." So they call him in. "We've got something to tell you." And they were not expecting that. They were not expecting to be told that Caroline had confessed to it. They were not expecting any of it. It absolutely was a thunderbolt. And Mike describes that, just that feeling of that whole surreal description he gave of that day, which I thought Elizabeth wrote very, very well in the book, because she said it was totally unreal. It's almost like watching someone else's story on the TV. You're removed from it. You're disengaged. And that's what Mike described.
Something I wasn't expecting was to see how quickly Mike and Elizabeth were to kind of wish no ill will towards Caroline's family, which is a very generous thing to do in their grief.
They were in shock, though. And I think that's very often the case. I've covered these cases all my career, 40 years, and you catch people in shock. When I'd go out when there'd been a terrible tragedy, and you go to see people and they're just working on like robots. They're on autopilot. They're not there. They're functioning on shock and adrenaline. or you see them later in that journey and they're furious. They're furious later on. And, they go through, there's 5 stages of grief. So, often where I've done interviews where people are in shock, later on they would say, well, I don't feel like that now, but I felt like that then. I was in shock. But remember, Elizabeth wrote the book after the trial. So she'd had quite a long time from the time Caroline was arrested, through Rachel's funeral, through Christmas, through Mother's Day, through all those things that people have to deal with, until the trial. And then she had the whole trial. They both were very giving. And I think Elizabeth's got very strong faith. And I think her religious beliefs and her belief in God was something she clung to in that time. And that's not to say she wasn't angry. She said that to me once. I am angry. I'm really angry, but I do forgive. She said to me once what she was very angry about was that the clues were there, the painting the room black, not coming out of your room. If only she'd have had the help she was crying out for. But those writings, they were secret. So no one saw those writings until the police went that day. I think if people had been aware of those writings, something may have happened. But she was actually seeing someone, Caroline. Her father had organised for her to see a psychologist. She was actually seeing someone, and that doctor came to the court to give evidence in the sentencing, talking about her sort of fixation when you strangle someone. It's very, very, very personal and very up close. And it's a very unusual case because women rarely kill outside their own families. Usually women will kill in a domestic violence situation, or they will kill their children because they're depressed. But they tend to kill within the families, and they don't tend to focus on someone outside the family, and not for 5 years. That plan grew bigger and more elaborate and more refined with every passing year. She had it off to a T, and she literally checked that list.
Was Caroline's doctor able to give any evidence of, mental impairment or anything along those lines in the case?
I don't think so. I think the general feeling was she was a depressive person. He felt she had potentially a borderline personality disorder, but lots of people have that and don't kill. It doesn't make you a killer. As she had the epilepsy, they were exploring, they were organising scans and things on her brain. They were very interested in whether there was some other underlying neurological disorder. That was being investigated at the time she was arrested. So they didn't have any tests to prove that. But Dr. Crudson visited her in jail over quite a period of time. And it's almost as though, and this is just my take, I'm not a psychological expert, I'm a journalist, but it's almost like in killing Rachel, she obliterated herself. It's like killing that perfection so she could take it. It was like a power. And what was really odd, by the time she came to court to be sentenced, I was really shocked because she described how Jem Southall, her fantasy alter ego, what her new persona would look like. She was going to be a cross between Katie Holmes, Rachel Barber, Claire Danes. She was going to be amazing. She was going to be like a fairy. She was going to be skinny. She was going to be pretty, going to dye her hair. By the time she came to court, that's exactly what she looked like.
Really?
I was absolutely blown away when they brought her up from the cells into the dock to be sentenced. This tiny, frail little fairy-like figure, fragile little woman that looked years younger than 20 years or however old she was when she was sentenced. She looked like the picture. She'd sketched a picture of Jem Southall, and she looked exactly like it. She drew this sort of sketch of what she wanted to look like. No pimples, nice wavy fair hair, skinny. She would have been a size 8 by then. She totally reinvented herself through Rachel Barber's death.
You mentioned that in that initial conversation with police, she admits to murder, but then she kind of puts in a non-guilty plea. She goes to ground. She doesn't say anything. And then just before the trial, she changes her tune and says she's guilty, doesn't she?
Yeah. So it doesn't become a trial. It becomes a plea. So the Barbers, they were all geared up for a trial, which was traumatic in itself. Bracing yourself for a trial where you've got to give evidence and relive it all. Trials are terrible things for the surviving family members of homicide victims. So having her change her plea at the last minute was a relief. I don't know whether there might have been a plan, and I'm only speculating, whether she would have pleaded some kind of mental impairment, maybe. But the fact was, she knew exactly what she was doing. And that's the difference, isn't it? Often people are depressed, but do they know what they're doing is wrong? You know, I look at Arthur Freeman. He's an example. He threw his little girl, Darcy Freeman, off the Westgate Bridge. And that was a big question. Was he bad or was he mad? Well, he was bad. He knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't mad. He wasn't so impaired that he knew he shouldn't kill his daughter and throw her off the Westgate Bridge. And that was the same with Caroline. She knew exactly what she was doing. She'd thought it over and mulled over it. I think as well, the fantasy of the murder takes root in your mind. Mm-hmm. And I think in her case it did. The fantasy of being someone else was what was driving it. She hated herself. She hated her life. Very unhappy. I'll have that girl's life and I'll be her, and then my life will be perfect. I will be perfect. And I think that's what drove that. And in some ways it worked, because courtesy of the prison food and all the pressure's off, she doesn't have to angst over it anymore. It's done. But once the fantasy's carried out, there's a tip over. So the fantasy was killing Rachel, so she did. Then it fell apart. Now she's got a body in her wardrobe, or she's got a body in her bathroom, which she then says in her writing, she then took to the wardrobe and put Rachel's body in the wardrobe. Now this was a stinking hot February week leading up to the Grand Prix. Imagine in the heat, which is why she'd written, get carpet cleaner. So it was a really thought about, premeditated, callous murder. But I think in some ways that she was completely obsessed with her, because amongst the writings they found, she'd clearly been stalking Rachel. She noted, Rachel has changed her hair, different hair colour. Rachel has a boyfriend. Rachel's at dance school. Rachel catches tram. She knew all her movements, and she had been stalking her. I think that's what I do find interesting. I took her letters to Professor Michel Pathé. Michel Pathé was working with Paul Mullen, Professor Paul Mullen. They're forensic psychiatrists. They set up the world's first stalking centre in Melbourne at that time in the early 90s. And I knew Michel quite well. I would often go there doing stalking stories. I took all Caroline's letters to show them. What do you make of these letters? And they said, what do you think? I said, well, I think it's like she is becoming her, isn't she? The fantasy's got bigger and bigger and bigger, but then she's carried it out. And the actual murder is now real. The fantasy's gone. She really did kill someone. And the reality is shocking. So then she's gone to panic. How am I going to get rid of her? Where's she going to go? The police called every courier and van company, hire company in Victoria and even into New South Wales. No one had sent a courier to that home, to that apartment in Paran on those days after the murder. No one. So how did she get that body? How did she get Rachel's body from that apartment in Paran? To this day, it bugs me. But she really had a fixation with Rachel, and Michel Pathé, looking through her notes and her own writings, she said, this is a typical case of stalker fusion. And it's where the stalker becomes so infatuated and obsessed with the object that they're fixed on that they almost fuse with them. So they become them. You know, it's a fusion. I did a case before this in Melbourne where a guy had stalked his ex-wife. He plucked his eyebrows, he dyed his hair, he tried to look like her. He wanted to be her. It's like ownership. And it was stalker fusion. John Lennon's stalker did it. Mark Chapman, he stalked John Lennon. In prison, after his arrest for killing John Lennon, he started to look like John Lennon, and he even married a Japanese wife that looked like Yoko. That was classic stalker fusion.
Well, Caroline ended up receiving a sentence of 20 years with an on-parole of 14 years. She was released in 2015. Have we seen any signs of remorse from her through any of the processes?
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe so. Her guilty plea, I suppose, by pleading guilty, is an acknowledgement of the wrongdoing. So she's acknowledged that. I didn't see any, though. I think her remorse was for herself. I certainly didn't see any. She became almost a bit of a celebrity in prison too, which was quite interesting. You know, she was the person who killed Rachel Barber. In some ways, she became quite a celebrity inmate.
A celebrity to who? The public or the inmates?
The inmates.
Why?
Well, she's a killer. There's a sort of pecking order of badness in those places. And she was the girl who was all over the paper for killing Rachel Barber. In a lot of ways, through Rachel's death, she got recognition that she'd not had. She got validation, albeit from the wrong places. But she got recognition, validation, and she was attractive. She reinvented herself. She was a whole other person through that little girl's death.
How did the Barbers feel upon her release?
I've moved away now, so I'm not in Victoria. I haven't spoken to them in quite a few years. But I did see Elizabeth on the TV, and I know that she was very concerned. Victims of homicide can go on the register, which means that they're allowed to be notified. If that offender is moved within the system to a different facility, they get to know. If they're released on parole, they have a say in the parole hearing. So it gives you those benefits. The downside of that is you're not allowed to know where they've gone once they're released. That information is confidential. And I think she was genuinely fearful. I believe Elizabeth was genuinely fearful. I saw her interview on the TV and she looked genuinely scared. And I think when the unthinkable has happened in your life once, anything can happen. It already did for their family.
Is there anything that stays with you from this case? Obviously, it's a very unique and complex crime, but there's also some really common human experiences that are explored, you know, jealousy, low self-worth. It's quite a hard one to unpack.
Yeah, you know, I think the sadness for me when it was all over was the utter destruction to two families. Now, I know that won't make me popular saying that, but there are more victims of the crime than people recognise. And I remember going to court once, and I think it was before Caroline's sentencing. Her father went over to Elizabeth and commiserated. He almost apologised for his daughter, that they were there at all. And it really stuck with me because I thought, yeah, there's so many more victims. What happened to Caroline's two younger sisters? What would that have been like for them? I know what it was like for the Barbers girls. It was horrific. It was horrific. You know, I remember Michael or Elizabeth telling me how the day after they'd gone to the service station to get the paper. There it was all over the front page. And it's like it's not really happening. I know one survivor of a terrible murder attempt said he used to get up in the night and Google himself in the middle of the night, and all these cuttings would come up and he'd think, that really was me. That is me. They're talking about me. You know, that sort of disbelief. Can this happen? I think the biggest thing for me was the utter waste. The waste of two girls' lives. Total waste. Rachel had so much promise. I can't imagine what she would have done. I think it would have been big things. But Caroline, if she'd have had help, maybe if it had been a week later and she'd had those scans and those tests and they'd have found some reason. She appealed that sentence, you know, she appealed after she was convicted and sentenced. She lodged an appeal to say the sentence was excessively harsh. Now, that is not the behaviour of a remorseful person. She dropped it, you know, it didn't go anywhere. But the fact is that she considered it. Maybe that was acting on advice. She's only a young girl still. You know, she was a very young girl. Maybe that was the advice she was given. But I think there was genuine fear from the family. Ashley Rose looked very like Rachel, the younger sister. And I think there was some fear there. But I remember going to their house. One of the first interviews I did, I went to the Barber's home, and they had photographs of Rachel all over the walls and a big frame photo. It was a big frame glass display cabinet with the dress that Rachel had worn. Elizabeth saw me looking at it, and that's often commonly seen when children have been murdered. You know, families keep medals and sporting medals, and there's stuff everywhere, and it's almost becomes a shrine. But she said, no, it was always like that. We always had things like that. She was always going to be a star. And I believe she was always going to be a star. And I think as the years have gone on, I often think about it because when I was asked to do the book, I had reservations about doing it. And I originally said I didn't think I could do it. And I gave them someone else's name. And the reason I hesitated was because I was the mother of a 15-year-old with leukemia.
Oh.
And I just thought, I don't know that I can do this tragic story. I would be working with a mother of a murdered 15-year-old, and my son may not survive this illness. He's 15. She's almost living my worst nightmare already, and I don't know that I can do this. And I did tell her that, and she said, no, I want you to do the book because you're a mother and you understand that pain. You know, you're grieving now. I was grieving for a living child who I thought might not make it. So she said, you know, you're older, you've got children, and you get it.
Thanks to Megan for assisting us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, Tahli Blackman and Christel Cornilsen, with audio design by Scott Stronach. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.